Welcome to the May call for the Agriculture and Forestry Action Team. Today we have two CCLers who are very knowledgeable about the forests. They're both retired U.S. Forest Service people. Dave Atkins was the National Office Program Manager for Wood Innovation and Woody Biomass, and Ken Skog was the project leader for economics, statistics, and life cycle analysis research, both for the USFS. And so they're going to be talking about the Fix Our Forests Act, and whichever one wants to go first, take it away.
All right, I'm going to go first and provide kind of some background context and set the stage for Ken to be diving into the specifics of Fix Our Forest Act. And I'll chime in. And just to add to the introduction, Ken worked in the research arm of the Forest Service, and I worked the first half of my career on the National Forest System side. So I was a NEPA nerd, and did a lot of work in project planning and implementation. And then the second half of my career, I was in our state and private forestry branch. We both have lots of years and understand how bureaucracy works and sometimes doesn't work. So I'm going to set the stage and connect FOFA with climate smart forestry. And why isn't it advancing?
Oh no. Well, unshare and share again.
Yeah.
We made sure he could share, but
right.
didn't do the next step.
Huh. So there, okay. I was using the up and down arrows and those weren't working for me. But I can advance. So I got 4 key items that I want to communicate before we turn it over to Ken. First, the fuel treatments work, and I'm going to give you some research and real world examples that we are in a forest crisis and that fast action is crucial in protecting carbon, protecting biodiversity, water quality, and quantity. The third item is this idea of, in the FOFA, talks about the balance of equities and looking at action versus no action. And the fourth is that it's economically prudent to do. Sorry. Working it with my finger screen is a little touchy. So this was a paper published last year, and it was a meta-analysis of 40 individual studies that looked at wildfires that encountered previous fuel treatment areas. And there's lots of really interesting stuff, but I'm going to focus on just 2 key points. This one, that thinning and then doing a prescribed burn, running a low intensity fire on the ground, on average, reduce the wildfire severity by 72% when the wildfire encountered it. And severity is determined by the proportion of the trees that were killed. Then the second highlighted green talks about in some situations where it was appropriate to use just prescribed burning alone, it reduced the severity by 62%. And where thinning was done in combination with piling and burning the tree tops and limbs and things, it also reduced the severity on an average of 62%. So it works. And here's a visual that reinforces what the research shows. These were 20-acre treatments that were done on Nature Conservancy land in Southern Oregon. And so you can see in the middle of the green forest that it was thinned and prescribed burned. The right hand picture, the no treatment, you can see solid black where it was a running crown fire. The important thing related to the previous slide, that thinning only, they did not pile and burn. So the limbs and tops of the trees had been left on the ground. And so when the wildfire came along, it didn't run through the tops of the trees, but there was enough fuel on the ground that it generated enough heat that it scorched most of the needles up in the canopy. And so doing a complete fuel treatment is really important. Here's an example down in Arizona of an area, basically it's called a shaded fuel break. It was thinned out, we treated the fuels. The fire was coming straight at the camera. You can see the black. It was a running crown fire, 150, 250, 200 foot flame lengths. It hit that thinned area, it dropped to the ground. They had crews in there. There were homes and a community down in the foreground, and it protected those. This is from an experimental forest in central Montana. And the left-hand picture is before this Wood Gulch wildfire. And this was part of a paired watershed study. And this was the control watershed. So there was no harvest, no roads. And you can see all the gray forest mixed in there. Those are dead lodgepole pine from a mountain pine beetle epidemic that went through in the 2000 aughts. On the right-hand side, you can see picture after that Wood Gulch fire, and you can see almost all of it is solid black. So it was a very high severity fire. And this was a lodgepole pine subalpine fir. So it's a higher elevation, cooler, drier than those ponderosa pine forests that I showed in the previous ones. So this is the treated watershed that was paired with this research, and it was roaded and harvests were put in 30 years ago. And with lodgepole pine, it was typically done with a clear cut, and you can see that there are still lots of gray dead trees in the areas surrounding those harvested areas. But because the harvested is younger lodgepole, only 30 years old, it wasn't affected by the mountain pine beetle. And also after the harvest, they had treated the fuels that were created by the harvest. And therefore, when the fire came, you can see on the right, it burned through the older mature forests where there was lots of fuel. And ran through there. So just some real world examples of how management can change those outcomes. These are just images that show effects in kind of downstream effects. This upper left is outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. There was about a 25,000 acre wildfire in drainage upstream. It had a thunderstorm come through, just kind of their typical thunderstorms that happen every summer. but because of the high severity fire, it behaved as what the hydrologists call a 500-year flood. And that was the chocolate muddy water running out of there. None of the houses in the area burned because they had done treatments around the houses, but multiple houses were affected by the flood. And then sadly, there was a 14-year-old girl that was killed. This lower right picture is from the Denver watershed, a reservoir that is filled with woody debris, and a lot of sediment came down as a result of, again, thunderstorms after a wildfire. And obviously affects the recreational experience of that mountain biker. And in the upper right, you've got power lines that came down as a result of the fire burning off those power poles. Since we're CCLers and carbon is a huge part of why we are supporting this, the bit of a complicated slide with these things, but if you look over on the left-hand side, there's black bars, gray bars, and white bars, high severity, moderate severity, and low severity. This is the proportion of the area that burned in those different severities when there was no treatment. The next set of columns is when a prescribed fire had gone through there. And then the third set is where it was a thinned and prescribed burn. And so you can see that the amount of high severity went down, the amount of moderate severity went down, and the amount of low severity went up. This graph to the right, you've got high severity on the left and low severity on the right, and they had plots that looked at the amount of carbon stored in the different components of the forest. So the open circles are the carbon stored in the live trees that survived the fire, and those decreased over the 6 years of the study. The black circles are the standing, or is the down dead material, and that went up considerably over the 6 years, and that's a result of the gray circles are the standing dead trees and the carbon that's in those, and those trees were rotting and falling down, snapping off, and became down fuel. The big thing with the carbon is at 2 years, you had 33 megagrams per hectare of carbon out there. 6 years later, you'd lost more than a quarter of that carbon. It was down to 24 as a result of fungus and insects feeding on that dead wood. So then if you look at the low severity, you have the most of the carbon is stored in live trees because they survived, and those trees grew. And so at the end of 6 years, you've got even more carbon stored. The snags and the down did their similar kinds of things. But from a carbon standpoint, we're losing carbon with the fire itself, but we continue to lose carbon as the dead trees deteriorate. Whereas if you have a low severity fire, that is a very different situation. I'm going to talk about two projects that were implemented and that get to the point of some of the changes in process that FOFA would allow. So the Colt Summit Restoration Project was started on the district in 2009. The environmental assessment decision notice was completed and released in 2010. It was appealed, which is a administrative appeals process that the Forest Service has. and the appellants had their appeals denied in 2011. A lawsuit was filed in September, and they asked the judge to enjoin or stop the implementation of the projects, which the judge granted. So the Forest Service could not implement the contracts that they were preparing. There were 32 organizations and individuals that had participated in the collaborative planning process, and they ended up signing amicus briefs. And so then the judge went through that, and in July of 2012, there were 12 points of contention. The Forest Service was supported by the judge on 11 of those. The 12th one, he said that the documentation for the cumulative effects on lynx was inadequate. Lynx is listed threatened and endangered species. So the project got returned to the Forest Service. They had to beef up the documentation of their cumulative effects analysis. That was done. They sent it back to the judge. It had to go through the judge's calendar. Then he can review it. So that was almost 2 years later. The judge comes back with a ruling that says, oh, it's okay. The documentation's adequate, and release the decision to go forward. The litigants took it to the Ninth Circuit Court the next month, and they requested an injunction, and it was denied. And so the Forest Service was allowed to move forward with their contracting processes and start implementing, doing their prescribed burns and such. 4 years later, the Ninth Circuit released their ruling on this and basically said the lower district judge ruling stood in place, but it was 8 years. And so this gets to that time and procedural delay. There was a wildfire that started west of this project treatment in 2023, and the prevailing winds are typically westerly, and it carried the fire to the east. And as you can see, they designed the projects kind of in a north-south orientation. Part of it was to protect this white area, which is private lands. And then over there is also a state highway with power lines trying to protect the infrastructure. This had been identified in the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And the different colors there represent different specific treatments. And the bottom line is it worked. When the incident command team came in, they were able to use those treatments to do some burnout operations and stop the wildfire from spreading to the east. This next one didn't turn out so well. It was on the Lincoln Ranger District. It was a larger landscape restoration project. Again, it was done through a collaborative process with many groups in the public, and it was a full environmental impact statement. And it was 8 years from the time of initiation to the decision. It was litigated. Again, the judge enjoined it from being implemented. The primary points of contention were lynx, bull trout, and grizzly bear habitat, endangered, threatened species. Wildfire occurred about a year into the litigation process, and it ended up about 130,000 acres, I believe. And it burned over half of the whole landscape that was planned. And it had far more impact on lynx habitat, bull trout habitat, and grizzly bear habitat than the treatments would have had. And so the remainder of the project was abandoned because in NEPA, if you have changed conditions from what you analyzed, you have to go back and reanalyze. And the forest chose not to do that. These two projects in this become really important as we talk about the litigation reforms and the balance of equities language within the law. So I talked about carbon defense. On some other time, I can talk about carbon offense with management, but I won't do that today in the interest of time. Sorry. The economic picture. We spend billions of dollars fighting fires every year. But this publication was done that was looking at, well, what's the true cost? Because those costs are just the suppression costs. There are lots of rehabilitation costs and costs that are imposed on society when those fires are in place. Damage to municipal watersheds that I showed you a picture of, agricultural watersheds, the need to reforest, damage to roads and culverts and bridges, power lines, water lines, sewer lines, houses that get lost, lives that are lost. And that does not include, and what they found is there's 2 to 10 times the cost after the fire suppression. So those billions get multiplied by 2 to 10 times. And this report did not include the social cost of carbon, which research a couple of years ago indicated is in the $185 a ton range. So turn that over to Ken so he can kick that into gear.
Okay, can everyone see my screen? Good, good. So I'll ask Dave to chime in here as he has points to add, since he has the direct national forest experience. I just know my understanding of national forest processes is kind of secondhand. But what I'll be talking about, focusing on how the Senate bill would change forest management planning and execution of projects, and also all the things that occur during that whole process, including and critically how litigation would be limited. So I guess we know why this bill matters. Wildfire severity is getting much worse. The Fix Our Forest Act is strongly based on science, and as I'll show at the end, it has pretty widespread bipartisan support. There are some environmental groups that are not on board, but others are. And it's in line with CCL's mission. So the key innovation in management planning is the use of fireshed management areas. And this would be a new layer of planning in the Forest Service and other agency planning process. And the Forest Service in 2019, the Rocky Mountain Station prepared a publication which identified 7,600 fire sheds all over the United States, and it evaluated these and identified those that are at the greatest risk for wildfire exposure and damage. So they went through this process has already been done by the Forest Service in terms of identifying the types of areas that should be the object of intense planning and management, and some of the criteria for identifying those areas were proximity to communities, potential harm to water systems, both tribal and other community water systems, and now also whether or not the areas are fire adapted ecosystems. In other words, in order to remain healthy, they have to have fire return at particular intervals, and the interval of return can vary depending upon the forest type, the elevation, topography, and so on. And there's also a criteria for identifying landscapes that are at risk of being converted from one vegetation type to another. We generally want to try to retain areas in particular vegetation types. So the intent, or the legislation, calls for identification of the top 20% of these fire sheds to be the object of scrutiny and planning for mitigation. And part of the process is to establish a fireshed registry, and I'll just read a note here about that. To support the transparency and coordination, the Act establishes a publicly accessible fireshed registry, which will provide interactive maps and detailed geospatial data on each designated fireshed. This registry will include past and planned hazardous fuel treatments, fire history, and projected wildfire behavior. By creating the shared platform, this legislation encourages all levels of the government, landowners, and the public to better understand their risk exposure and restoration needs. The fireshed model represents a shift away from managing fire risk based solely on administrative boundaries, such as individual national forests or BLM districts, toward landscape scale, risk-informed prioritization. It is intended to better match the scale and urgency of the wildfire crisis. So that's it would also be a communications device, this fireshed registry, that will help facilitate planning across many ownerships. A third element is that there are required fireshed management assessments, and these are going to be interagency assessments. And there'll be an overseeing board or body that will be party to a Wildfire Intelligence Center. Be a new national center created to coordinate wildfire modeling, data sharing, and decision support across federal, state, and tribal agencies. And the purpose of the assessments, that would be these joint assessments, would be to identify wildfire risks and sensitive associated resources, recommended treatments, and then, to the extent possible, draw on existing plans across all of these stakeholders and ownerships. And the foundation is to use best available science and traditional ecological knowledge to inform these assessments. To take action to do the treatments identified, there would be an expansion of the shared stewardship agreements across boundaries, to include both states and tribes. These are agreements now used within the Forest Service to contract for a thinning treatment or prescribed fire treatment, and so on. But these would be expanded to use with these other landowners, the states and the tribes. This shows a map of Oregon and Washington. You can't tell, for instance, you can see Olympia, Washington here. And these are fire sheds that are identified by the process the Forest Service has gone through to, using its criteria to identify high risk fire sheds across Washington and Oregon. And I think the colors have to do with the predominant ownership in the localities. So that's an example of how example of some identified high-risk fire sheds. And you can see it's pretty highly focused. It's not, it's not covering huge swaths of the, it's really focusing on those that are the highest risk. And this is this is the map of the entire United States. I hope it's not too difficult. This is, there was a process that was undertaken for the development of the wildfire crisis strategy. It's a document, a process the Forest Service went through and identified 21 wildfire crisis landscapes. In other words, multiple areas that have multiple fire sheds. So this is just to show that the Forest Service has gone through this exercise of identifying the very highest risk areas and putting them into broader landscape categories as well. So there's lots of information already to inform the execution of the plans called for in the legislation. So key features of the legislation are to streamline review and put limits on litigation. So one key limitation is that these identifying of the fireshed management areas, the establishment of the registry, and the execution of fireshed assessments are all exempt from NEPA review. There wouldn't be required environmental assessments or environmental impact statements. There would be an expansion of categorical exclusion areas. In other words, land areas that could be exempted from NEPA environmental assessments or environmental impact statements, increasing, I think it's from, Dave, remember, is it 5,000 to 10,000? In other words, it's 10,000.
Yeah, it's from 3,000 up to 10,000.
3,000 up to 10,000. But this isn't a get out of jail free card and do anything you want on these areas. Even categorical exclusions, even areas that are identified for categorical exclusions, because of their high fire hazard, still must comply with existing regulations and the requirements in forest plans. A forest plan could protect riparian areas, or it could be managed to enhance the habitat for particular species. Those features still must be incorporated in whatever plan is made for categorical exclusions. And these areas cannot have extraordinary circumstances such as threatened and endangered species of concern, cultural resources of concern, or areas that have wetlands and the action would impact wetlands. So if any of those things are present, then those things still need to be protected. Now, Dave, do you know that if that means that an EA or an EIS would still have to be done if there were these extraordinary circumstances?
If they're integrated into it, if they could be excluded from the area of planned work, then they could use the Cat X and they would just exclude those areas. But if they're in the cases that I gave where there was, lynx and grizzly bear and bull trout habitat, they would still have to do an environmental assessment or an EIS.
Okay.
And I just want to insert on the categorical exclusion. It's an exclusion from the documentation of the analysis in an EA or an EIS. It is not an exclusion from assessing the effects of the project. And so some people and some groups are saying, oh, this is going to be lawless and there won't be anything. That the agency still will look to see if there are sensitive plants or what the effects are going to be on wildlife habitat or the watershed. Those things are still examined, but they don't have to do the documentation. They don't have to, put that all together in an environmental assessment or an EIS. So that it's an important distinction there that sometimes gets muddied up.
Okay, thanks. So another element is that it allows certain emergency declarations to speed up certain consultation processes. For instance, consultations that are required under the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. The the consultations still have to occur, but they are put on a faster track because they are wildfire risk reduction projects. They're not an elimination of a requirement. There's a speeding up of meeting the requirement. And then there are a bunch of limitations on litigation, which I'll get to on the next slide here. Lawsuits must be filed within 150 days of public notice of a proposed action. And I think I read that currently under the Administrative Procedures Act, there is no limitation, or certainly it's much longer than 150 days. So that's something that will really require much faster action on the part of those who want to appeal. And this is where the point that Dave made about balance of equities come in. Judges are required, when making a determination to allow a temporary or permanent injunction, they can only make that determination of a temporary or permanent injunction only if, and this is the balance of equities, the claimed harm by the plaintiffs of doing the treatments is anticipated to exceed the harm of not doing the treatments. In other words, the combination of the risk and the damage of the wildfire. So this is a new requirement on judges in making determinations on injunctions. And if there are court-ordered fixes, for instance, more documentation for links, for example, in that case that Dave cited, the court-ordered fixes must be made within 180 days. So there can be, the process can be moved along if it's just a matter of a documentation. And then another key feature is if there's some part, but certain acreage of the project, which for which something is inadequate, that will not prevent the project from going forward on the remainder of the area. In other words, the fact that there's a limitation on a certain part of the area won't stop the entire project. So those are the key changes as I understand it on litigation limits. And then in terms for features for executing projects will be expanded. So stewardship contracts can be up to 20 years long. Currently, they're only up to 10 years long. And what the 20-year extension will do is it'll allow a business to get up and running and run for 20 years with the assurance, as much assurance as you can get with a government contract, that they will have business for 20 years. They'll be getting material from treatments for over a 20-year period, so they can make a product of some sort. They can make lumber, or they can make panels, or they can use wood to power a power plant, or for some extended period. So this is a big deal in terms of businesses. And then there's a disincentive to canceling these agreements because there's a 10% cancellation fee for the contractors would be entitled to. It also expands good neighbor authority, which means that we can allow tribes or states to actually undertake the final development and execution of a treatment on land. And presumably in these circumstances, the Forest Service or the federal government would be providing the funding necessary if there was funding required. And there are also features that encourage treatments to be led by, or either restoration treatments to be led by NGOs, and also fire districts and water utilities. So all of those different entities would be encouraged to lead restoration efforts beyond just the federal efforts.
And I'll just add in, those are intended to expand the capacity. Right now, the Forest Service is limited to the employees that they have. And so being able to have states or tribes or other organizations do some of that work. The other piece that I would say is that the decision about the projects still resides with the Forest Service line officer. So the people that are looking at the forest plans and those kinds of things, they make the decision. It's the tribes or the states or the water districts can help with the laying out and implementation part of it.
So there are a number of authorizations, which mean they're authorizing the possibility of funding coming later for these features. A wildfire intelligence center, which would be across virtually all the federal agencies that you'd have as part of the board of this center would be all of the agencies that have manage federal land in some fashion. And I don't recall I don't know if it has state participants or not. I have to go double check, or state and tribal. It may well have those as well. It promotes expanded programs for community wildfire risk reduction. There's more, in principle, more funding for those activities on the part of communities. And then further investments in reforestation, improving seed supply chain, and climate adaptive planting. There would also be support for technology, biochar development, remote sensing, and aerial suppression. And then the biggie is that all of these things will be authorized, but there will have to be appropriations to actually have these activities, both these infrastructure activities on this slide, plus any funding that's required to actually execute treatments, because many of these treatments are going to cost money, as opposed to having treatment. A relatively small proportion of the treatments are likely to provide enough timber to pay for the treatment. That's usually the exception rather than the rule. So there's going to have to be a flow of money. And the studies I've been involved in, those are run into the billions of dollars to do the extent of treatments that are envisioned. So I saw somewhere that there's a backlog of 80 million acres across the West that really needs treatment, and currently the Forest Service is only doing about 2 million acres of treatment a year. So there's a big backlog. Benefits: faster treatments, reduced emissions, resilient landscapes. Concerns: reduce NEPA oversight. But we tried to indicate the degree to which there are still NEPA protections, even with categorical exclusions. There have to be protections for the I can't remember the term for it, but these special circumstances, all those still need to be protected.
Extraordinary circumstances.
Extraordinary circumstances, yeah. And then their litigation expedited processes. So the key thing here is, of course, this is going to be, a lot will be in agency execution, and how the courts come down on the balancing of the equities. As this seems to be a new feature. I expect the balance of equities has come up in other circumstances, but it'll be a new exercise that the courts will have to engage in to determine what needs to be restrained, because the harm of doing it may be greater than the harm of not doing it. So good stuff for CCL. Here are all the supporters. It's bipartisan sponsors, Democratic and Republican governors, bunch of state agencies. Under environmental groups, the notably Nature Conservancy, Audubon Society, Wildlife Federation, Environmental Defense Fund, and so on. CCL prominently, and others. So that's what I have.
So Glenn asks a question, are senators in the eastern US supporting this or even paying attention to this, given that it's, focused on Western federal lands? And I would say it's much less of a concern for them. It should be a concern just from a budgetary standpoint because of the amount of money that we spend fighting fires, but then also the amount of money that gets spent for fire insurance, for repairs and restoration afterwards. And then the reality is climate change is changing the fire regimes, particularly in the Southeast. I mean, we saw in both North and South Carolina wildfires going this spring. And so, but that's one of the challenges. And I guess what I would say is, and it goes to John Skogs' question, what's the basis for groups and people opposing this bill? And I would say there's the really hardcore opposition are groups that do not want to see any kind of commercial harvest of trees from federal lands, the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management. They want it just as strict preservation and no harvest at all. Other people are concerned with the changes in the procedures that people or groups are not going to have enough time to provide the oversight and to be able to challenge decisions. I would argue that that's really not a limitation, because the part of what this does is it puts the burden on people to get their litigation filed quickly, but it also puts a burden on the judges and the courts to make their decisions. And it also puts a burden if a decision gets remanded to the agencies, it puts a timeline on them to respond very quickly. And so my looking at this is that it doesn't take away the litigation process at all. What it does is speeds up the process, and that's real familiar with the regulatory reform language that we lobbied on last year, related to transmission and energy development. And we're just saying we want to get to a yes or a no in a much shorter period of time.
So I have a question.
Oh,
So there are some groups like the Nature Conservancy and, well, all of those, I think, did not come out in favor of the House bill, but they have come out in favor of the Senate bill. What are the differences between the House and Senate bill that made it more palatable, more acceptable to environmental groups?
David, there's one thing I know for sure. I didn't look at all the details, but one feature is that there is stronger coordination required. This Wildfire Intelligence Center is only present in the Senate bill, so I think the coordination collaboration features are stronger. I don't, there was, I know one other feature just was that the litigation limit for the filing time limit was 120 days in the House bill. It's 150 days in the Senate bill. It's a small difference, but yeah.
That was.
Yeah, also the Forest Service gave testimony last week, and they were largely in agreement with the person who testified, largely in agreement with these primary features of the Senate bill, and they went through, title by title, and um, which I don't think they did for the House. I'm not aware of them doing that for the House bill. And also, Jen Tyler, when she spoke, said that she was of the view that the House would be fine with accepting the Senate version. She didn't think there would be contention on the part of House members to push back for.
The Senate version also has a subtitle that's really focused on the use of prescribed fire. And the House version mentions the use of prescribed fire, but it doesn't really go into much detail, and the Senate version does. And so as Ken was going through in that Fire Intelligence Center, I think would be really valuable in the implementation of prescribed fire. And this is going to require funding. Ken's bottom line question is, having good weather forecasting is really important to managing wildfires, but it's also very important in managing and implementing prescribed fires. And so I suspect that the Nature Conservancy and some of those groups were really pushing to get that prescribed fire piece added in there, and that Fire Intelligence Center. And then I'm sure that going from 120 to 150 days, gives people a little bit more time. 5 months is I think plenty of time for people to review and put together their litigation plan, if that's what their plan is, if that's what they feel is needed.
Thanks.
So I'm looking at other votes here. Or not votes, but questions in the chat. Yeah, North Carolina mostly voted for it. That's great. Thanks, Matthew. Greg, did you look at the TNC comments on the House? Was there anything specific you wanted to bring up?
I did look at it. It was too long to paste in, which is why I put the link to the supporters. So, Nancy, just a slight subtlety, TNC was on the statement saying these are groups who support in principle the House version. They wouldn't have been quoted on a statement like that unless they were willing to engage in the conversation. So I was originally going to there's 1,000-character limit, which I learned in the chat, and this was 1158. So TNC appreciates the serious undertaking of Chairman Westerman and Representative Peters to craft legislation. And then it goes on, we look forward to continue to work to improving the bill, and we urge leaders in Congress to do the same so that we can enact meaningful policy reform to address this growing challenge. So they were very much engaged in the process, and they remain engaged from the House version to the Senate version. And my guess is the things you've touched on, Dave and Ken, are some of the things which they wanted to see improve. But to say that they weren't supporting, you simply wouldn't have been listed on this statement unless you were deeply engaged in supporting in principle the direction things were heading.
And Glenn, you talk about the Appalachian forests, and the use of fire is really important in the Southeast, and actually that Indians did a lot of burning all through the Appalachia. The forests back there have changed dramatically. They were oak, hickory, chestnut forests, which are thick barked trees that are adapted to periodic fire. And that's changed a lot over the last 400 years for lots of different reasons. The use of fire in those forests to help restore biological diversity is worthwhile. And just as a detail, there was a Gatlinburg, Tennessee, had a fire about 6-7 years ago, as I recall, and it burned up a lot of houses and killed some people. And I saw a paper by a professor from back in the East who does fire research. And one of the things he pointed out in his commentary is that when and I forget which park it was that was established in the mountains there, before the park was established, there was lots of burning done. There were inholdings of private land, and the Indians had burned, and a lot of the settlers, the Euro settlers, continued those burning practices. And when the Park Service established the park, they eliminated that intentional burning, and he attributed the accumulation of fuels as contributing to the severity of that fire that ended up impacting Gatlinburg. So even though this is focused on the West, I think there is good reason to expand the thought process to all of our forests that's appropriate to that ecosystem. So
it seems like the wording doesn't specify in the West. So it's just, according to the maps, the highest wildfire risks are in the West.
Yes.
But it sounds like if there were high, wildfire risks in the East, in the future, then those would be included as well.
right, and that's on the training that Jan and Dana did. Somebody had asked about updating, and so I think it's a 5-year cycle that these fire sheds get updated. So hopefully we get treatments done in some of these areas, and they drop down in priority, and other locations can get added in and have the focused effort.
So I've found some of the groups that oppose. There's Earth Justice, and apparently it says a bunch of other groups filed a letter opposing the House version. I don't know what they feel about the Senate. Center for Biological Diversity criticizes the waiving of environmental reviews for new fire sheds. Defenders of Wildlife have concerns about biodiversity. So those are some of the places.
And I would say that Center for Biological Diversity complaint about waiving NEPA on the fireshed assessment process is spurious. NEPA, the intent of NEPA is to assure that projects that are going to implement something on the ground have the environmental effects analyzed and displayed. Since the fireshed assessment doesn't actually do anything on the ground, it's just an assessment. And so NEPA, that provision in the law, from my understanding of NEPA, is not needed. I think they wrote it in there because there are groups that will challenge and say, oh, you should have done NEPA on this. I've experienced that in my career as, oh, but NEPA is about actions on the ground, actually doing something. The assessment of fire sheds is just an analysis and a priority setting. It doesn't actually result in implementation. So then the CADX or the EA or the EIS is done on the actual actions that are proposed.
Okay, we're at the hour, and I would like to thank Dave and Ken very much. This was wonderful, and I will post the recording to our YouTube site in the near future. So
Thank you.
thank you
Have a great
all.
day.
Yep.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Bye.